So 100,000 people have probably made this video before, so why would you bother watching mine? I don't know. It's something to talk about because there's a lot to say about why I would bother using Linux. And the usual arguments come up is like it's more free, it's got potential that Microsoft doesn't, it's less buggy, which maybe not entirely true. But generally, like why would somebody become so obsessed in Linux that they would start a whole channel? Part of it I think is just because I'm autistic. And Linux became like a hobby of mine, but I wanted to go through kind of some of my history with computers in general just to kind of explain where I'm at. So when I was a kid, like 5 or 6 or whatever, my dad had gotten my brother and I computers from a garage sale. And my computer I still remember because I ended up taking it apart so many years later, and it had some sort of Pentium, like a 2 or 3 or something. It had a GeForce 2 Asus with 64 megs of VRAM, and it ran Windows 95. That's all I remember about it. And for the longest time, that's what I had. I eventually, my friend's mom had given me a laptop, which I think I broke the screen on it. And then my dad got me a Dell D610 Inspiron. Oh, no, actually, before this, he had gotten me a Compaq CQ57. And that was just like a cheap budget laptop, but one day the daughter board broke on it. No, actually, it must have been a motherboard issue because we replaced the daughter board. And that was kind of the problem with like Vista era computers, is not only was Vista a piece of shit, but this was also where computers started getting a lot cheaper. It was hard to get a cheap computer back in like the XP days. But when Vista came out, computers were a lot more mainstream, and companies were trying to ship computers with Vista on them, with like specs that were way too low. It could barely run Vista. So eventually my audio stopped working like entirely, and I couldn't do anything about it. This was the era before you could just go to Amazon and buy a little USB headphone adapter and you were good to go. You had to, like, yeah, I'm sure I could have, or I don't know, could you have done that back then? I'm sure they had something, but I didn't know about it. I don't have the skills I have now where I have $5 to spend on a audio adapter. But we tried everything. We tried replacing the daughter board, we tried taking apart the whole computer, putting it back together, flashing a new BIOS, anything that would get it to work. And then eventually my dad said, okay, I'm gonna burn a DVD with Ubuntu on it. So he installed Ubuntu, and surprisingly the Wi-Fi worked, and I used that for a bit, and that was what I got on my computer. And this was around, I think, Ubuntu Precise Pangolin. I want to say it might have been Quetzal, because I remember having to read guides on it, and it was all Precise Pangolin. And Linux back then, I'm always surprised when I hear people that have been running Linux for like 10 or more years, because when I was using Ubuntu, one of the things you had to do to get support, obviously there was like forums and stuff, and so you would browse the forums and see if they had the same issue as you, or they were doing what you wanted to do. And a lot of guides were written with Ubuntu in mind, so it was easy to find stuff, even back then, because Ubuntu wasn't like super new back then, but it was also like the only real usable desktop at the time. So I was using it, and eventually that computer, because we just gave up on it after the audio didn't work for so long, he got me a Dell D610. I don't know why I said Inspiron, I think it was a Latitude. Yeah, Dell Latitude D610 with 1 GB of RAM, 30 gig hard drive, and a Pentium M or a Pentium D. Can't remember, I think it was a Pentium M. And it ran XP. And that's what I had for a bit, was I had a computer running XP. But at this point, because I now knew about Linux, I was able to, I either burnt my own DVDs or I had like a 1 GB flash drive. I think I had a 1 gig flash drive. And I remember it because my dad got me it at a conference. And at this point, I think I was like into homebrew on my Wii and stuff. So I was starting to get a bit more into computers, but I remember I tried to install Linux and I went with Manjaro, and Manjaro worked fine. You know, that was pretty cool. But this was like when Manjaro was new, kind of, using it, and it was fun. I didn't really understand the differences. It just seemed like Linux to me. I didn't really see the difference between Pac-Man and After or whatever. It was all just kind of same thing. It's not too different. Because Ubuntu had taught me to use the terminal, because back then there really wasn't a GUI for everything. Like, you had to use the terminal for some things, and part of that was installing packages, because this was late GNOME. Yeah, because I remember when they said, oh, Ubuntu's getting a new desktop. And I always thought that was like crazy, because since I was used to Windows, you got whatever Windows shipped and it stayed that way. But with Linux, they're like, oh yeah, we can just ship a whole new desktop and your desktop will be completely changed. And that was crazy to me. So I was farting around with so I think I had GNOME 2 when I first started, and then it changed into Unity, which I didn't like as much. But anyways, like, after I tried Manjaro, I started like distro hopping and trying new distributions, and because I didn't really game, on my computer. One, I didn't have a gaming computer, but two, I had I had like a GameCube or something back then, so I just played games on the GameCube. There wasn't really anything I wanted to play on PC at the time. And eventually, when I was in high school, I think I had two friends, and one of them had built his own PC, and the other one had built his own PC, and I had them like duke it out to find the best parts for me. But in the end, what happened was my dad got me a Dell 660 Inspiron, which had like an Ivy Bridge i5, 8 gigabytes RAM, single stick, and like a 1 terabyte hard drive. And so I bought I think I bought a 750 Ti, and I put that in there. And then I like swapped out the power supply to give it more power, even though I probably didn't need to. And I added like a 240 gig SSD, which I had gotten on a Black Friday sale when SSDs were still kind of expensive. And that was great. It ran like shit, and I couldn't really play all the games I wanted to at max settings or whatever, but I liked it. It was a good computer. And to this day, because what I started doing was I started like replacing parts on that machine, and I eventually did like a case, motherboard, CPU thing. My first PC I built, though, out of that, it exploded because I put an Ivy Bridge CPU in a Haswell socket, and I didn't realize that I had the wrong socket, because 1150 looks a lot like 1151 or whatever the previous socket was. So I didn't know, and it blew up. But I went back and I rebuilt it and got new parts, and then that became my computer for a while, and to this day I just replace parts on it. But I never really lost an interest in Linux. I stopped using it for a while because, I got this gaming computer, I'm gonna play games on it. Linux wasn't really suitable for games yet, but every now and then people would tell me how great Linux is on because one of the things when I mentioned forums for Ubuntu support, when I started distro hopping, a lot of them would come with HexChat pre-installed, or they would come with Pigeon or some other IRC client, and they would say, join our support channel if you have issues, and I would join under IRC, and that's how I would get support. So I'm always surprised when people say that they've been using Linux for like 10 plus years and they say, I've never used IRC before. Because I'm like, that was the Linux community back then. We didn't have like Discord, and nobody was using TeamSpeak for this kind of thing. They were using open source hackable software. So everyone was on either forums or IRC. And that's where I started talking to people that were in, and I was a kid at the time. So it's not like I couldn't really handle myself in an adult chat room, especially because I'm bipolar. So if I had a manic episode, I would easily get banned from whatever I was in. But it was cool talking to people that knew about Linux, and I still like doing that today. Is I'll talk to people on either IRC, Discord, or whatever about Linux, because it's cool. And this one, and so I was using this desktop though, and eventually I got the bug to try out Linux again, and this must have been, when's the last time I did that? Shit, Because I mean, obviously I use it full time now, but I would try it in bursts before. And I forget what distributions I was using. Oh yeah, I joined an IRC for a Reddit called Build a PC. And I'm glad I'm not there anymore because I'm sure a lot of those people hold like a grudge on me to this day for how much of a shithead I was. But and also they kind of offer shitty advice for building PCs now, which is kind of sad. I'm totally out of the loop on that, but I used to like have a lot of fun with PC building, learning about the hardware and how it performed and stuff and what it did. And that was cool. But one guy said I use Arch Linux, and this was back in 2014, 2015. So he said you should try Arch because you use Linux. And I said, oh yeah, you know, I've used Ubuntu. It's really cool. I've used Manjaro. And he said, well, try Arch. It's got a complicated installation, you know, so don't be too put off. And I remember my first time, I didn't get it quite right, but I kept going at it, and I eventually installed it correctly. This was way before Arch install was even a concept, so you had to, and I don't know if the wiki was as concise as it is now, because now it's like one page, whereas the Gentoo handbook's like a mile long. And so I installed Arch, and I didn't really stick with it for very long, but it was cool that, you know, I learned how to do this terminal install thing. So I ended up on 4chan or 8chan's IRC. Yeah, I think it was 8chan's IRC. And there was a guy there who was making a Linux distribution called Clover OS, which is based on Gentoo. And of course, the big 4chan meme, you know, installed Gentoo, and I really wanted to. I really wanted to try it because back then it was actually like super difficult to install. It's not like it is now where it's a lot easier with stage 3 tarball and all that. So I never ended up installing Gentoo manually. But I started getting into like Windows 10 modding around that time, theming, and so I ended up in servers for that as well as like Android ricing, trying to customize your phone, and I still use some of that software today. Stuff like a Nova launcher, and you know, I got like a special icon pack, and I did like sidebars back on KitKat. That was always really cool. And there was even like when you rooted your phone, you could like install Substratum themes, and all of that's changed. And I've completely stopped following development because it got way too complicated, and a lot of the software just never matured, you know, and Google's been kind of fucking around with Android too much. So, but I liked Windows modding, and I had been doing that since like Windows 7. I skipped over 8 and 8.1, went straight to 10 for my Windows 7 machine, where I think I had a pirated Windows 7 Ultimate license, and I upgraded it to 10 for free. It was around that time though, not quite that time, but as time went on, I realized that I wasn't modding Windows for the right reasons. You know, I didn't like how hacky it was, because a lot of these scripts and stuff, they required like root privilege, or not root, but they required not just admin access, but they wanted like significant access to your machine, and the antivirus was always throwing a fit, you know, because it's always trying to change system files. And I didn't really like how I was modifying Windows. I didn't feel like it was an intended use case. You know, it always felt like something that was sort of walled off and you weren't supposed to fuck with it or else it could break stuff. And eventually I decided, you know, as I experimented more with Linux, I remembered my days in Ubuntu where everything was a file, and I could just fuck around with anything I wanted, and I could edit it and do whatever to it. And I always thought that was cool, that the Linux file system was like you had full access to your machine. There was nothing off limits. Of course, I've explored that more because Ubuntu doesn't really give you that much choice in what you get. But as I went into distributions like Arch, I realized, oh, a lot of this stuff is interchangeable and there's multiple options for it. So that really got me interested in like learning how these different things work together, what they did differently, and which one I should use for my system. You know, what was the best one. And when I switched back to Linux, I stayed on Windows for a while. I think I even installed 11 for a bit because I was still gaming and Proton wasn't really a thing yet. You know, it was kind of a thing, but not yet, you know, and I still wanted to do stuff like mod my games and make mods for Skyrim and stuff, and I didn't really want to mess around with it. But as I was doing this, because I started switching back and forth between Windows and Linux, I was like, okay, each time I switch back and forth, I don't want to have to use an entirely different suite of software. I'd rather use the same thing on both systems and try to have parity. Even like with my UI, I want to be able to hit the same shortcuts and get the same effect. Like if I hit Windows key E, I want it to open up my file manager. If I want to launch an image editor, because when I was in high school, I learned on Adobe Fireworks, and that was my image editor for a long time. But then because I mostly dealt with like images I downloaded from the internet, WebP came out, and I was kind of sad that a lot of my formats no longer worked with Fireworks, like animated PNG, because I used to make GIFs and stuff, GIFs, whatever. And I would download files and try to import them, and they wouldn't import. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have to switch to Photoshop because Fireworks is discontinued. And I never really liked the workflow of Photoshop. It was too different from Fireworks. So I was like, well, if I have to learn something anyways, because I really don't like having to crack this software, it's really annoying to do. And sometimes I get viruses, so I'm like, I don't want to fuck with that anymore. And I ended up downloading GIMP, and I've kind of learned GIMP over the years. I don't really use it much, but when I need to do something, I do it in GIMP, and it's helped. You know, it's like once you figure it out, it's not that bad, but it's obviously not anything comparable to Photoshop, obviously, and I don't think it ever will be. But that's not really something I need it for. All my edits are really simple. So I started building, you know, my Windows system to be kind of like my Linux system, where I'm using the same kind of software. And when I started doing that, I realized it was easier to switch back to Linux later. So then I just started staying in Linux for longer and longer. And eventually when Proton came out and I could really game on it, then I was pretty much ready to switch to Linux permanently. You know, I had all my software on Linux. I was finally doing pretty much everything I wanted to. But there's always stuff to learn, you know, and that was what was really cool about it. Was with Windows, there's not really a whole lot to learn. It's familiar, it's usable, but I don't get much freedom in what I do with it. So with Linux, I could switch out everything. You know, I could get that new desktop. I could swap out my file manager if I didn't like the one I was using. I could do... oh yeah, and the other thing too was I started having to use a lot of third-party utilities on Windows in order to get the same functionality I did on Linux. Whenever I installed Windows, one of the first things I would have to do is go through a list of software I use. I would install ShareX to get a better screen capping tool, and it would like upload to Imgur, which was important because, especially like if you're using Discord, you have a file limit, or if you're on IRC, you don't have an image host at all. So you needed your own. And so I would install ShareX, I would use Infran View, and then I switch over to Nomax for image viewers because the Windows image viewer just didn't support all the formats. I would have to install 7-zip because, 7-zip existed. And it was honestly better than WinRAR. And I would need to install that to open up my archives, and then I needed VLC for a video player because the Windows video player didn't support all my formats. And it started getting really annoying that Microsoft, being the premium operating system, didn't have this support built into it. And on Linux, you have to install the third-party stuff anyway, so you just would. But it ended up having a lot more support, and I realized that free software oftentimes was better updated than proprietary software. And that was always sort of something I didn't think about, was when you have this proprietary software, because you can't control the source code, you end up going without support on it, and it doesn't always do everything you want it to. And I started to see the value in that when I switched over to free software, because one, it didn't cost anything, and I never liked paying for software. because I always felt like my access to it was limited, where I would pay for it, and then what happens if I lose my license, or what happens if my account goes down, or whatever, what happens if they shut down the software, like what happened with Fireworks. I said I need something that's community driven, and it will last for longer than I need it, you know? Or if they shut down, there's an alternative, and I wanted to have a contingency plan in place, and that's what I talked about in my second to last video, or last to last video, was I need something that is my backup in case things go south. And that's why I've been distro hopping so much lately, is because now that I've got this NVIDIA card, I want to make sure that if for some reason NixOS goes dead or something, I can switch over to CacheOS and all my stuff will still work. And that's become important to me, as I've seen so many things exist and then not exist, or exist in a very dead state, you know, or they're just unmaintained. And when you're using a computer, it's like, yeah, you can keep a computer for as long as you can, but eventually you're going to have to upgrade. Eventually your hardware goes out of date so far that even the Linux kernel's not going to support it anymore. And you have to have that plan in place. You know, you gotta stay reasonably up to date. And it's the same thing with software. Time continues to move forward and new things come out, and you do need to have the backing of a community that can update their software. Or if they can't, you need to have the freedom to choose other software that does what you need it to. And that's really what I want to get to, the main point about why I use Linux, is because there is potential there that Microsoft no longer has. I've given them so many years. I've given them 10 years for them to add basic shit, you know, shit that everybody uses. Like, it took them so long just to get WinRAR, like, you know, the RAR file support, the archives. It took them so long just to get some image format supported in their viewer. And like, why am I paying money for this? Why am I paying money to be left behind what the open source options are giving me? You know, and it always seems like, I mean, like, the cycle of the Windows user is the operating system sucks, but then something else worse comes out and they're like, oh, actually this was always good. And that's what's happened with Windows 10. Is I didn't like Windows 10 when it came out. I didn't like the ads. I didn't like the I mean, the UI was okay. You know, I actually kind of prefer flat design. When I was using Windows 7, I would try to mod it to be more flat, but I didn't like the inconsistent UI where there was like light mode stuff and then dark mode stuff, and then some stuff hadn't been updated for like 20 years. And they're finally just starting to kind of work on that. And I'm like, nah, I gotta wait another 10 years for you to, you know, polish everything out. And why would I do that when Linux already has that stuff polished out? You know? And that's kind of the crux of it all, is that I'm using Linux because not only am I freer, but I'm getting support that I never got on Windows. I'm getting access to things that were like third-party utilities in Windows, or were very annoying to use. Like, if you wanted YouTube DLP or whatever, you would, on Linux, you just install the package and it's right there in your command line. On Windows, I had like 50 copies of the exe because I would paste them into whatever folder I was working in, and eventually I'd have like a collection of 20 of them and I would delete them. And eventually what had happened was, I have 5 hard drives on my computer. I have 2 M.2 solid state drives, and I mean, obviously, but those are my 2 OS drives, and I keep 2 because if I either need Windows for something, I can install Windows, but right now I only have Linux on both of them, and I have NixOS on one because that's what I'm using right now. But on the second one is my backup drive, and if Linux breaks, I have a backup with all my stuff on it in case I need a few days to prepare. So I'm never left in the dust, you know. But my third drive is a 4 terabyte solid state drive. And for the longest time, I was storing everything on an 8 terabyte spinning Rust drive, and that was my media drive. because my goal after all this distro hopping was, okay, I need to, and even when I was on Windows, I tried to keep everything super, super separated from my OS drive, because I knew Windows could break at any moment and I would have to reinstall for whatever reason. And I did. About every 6 months I would have to reinstall Windows. And it's the same thing on Linux. Like, let's be honest, Linux breaks for me no matter what distro it is. So I'm expecting to have to reinstall, or I'm expecting to distro hop. So I keep everything OS related on the OS drive, and I keep anything that's like a media. I keep all my media on that 4 terabyte SSD. Now, because my SSD has a lot of rare shit on it, like albums and TV shows that are really hard to find, I also have that that SSD backed up to a 4 terabyte hard drive, and then that one, I had bought an 8 terabyte drive, so I backed it up to the 8 terabyte drive. So that's kind of overkill, but if 2 of my drives die, or if I accidentally DD my SSD or something, I've got 2 separate drives with all my shit on it. And so I can always swap out the drive and copy it all back. And I don't expect everybody to do that, obviously. You know, you want something that's reliable, and I've never found computers to be that reliable. There's always some problem with them that I have, and I have to clean it up. And I think everybody should really do that. Don't just like live with your computer crashing all the time. Fucking fix it, you know, like fix your computer. But that's kind of the thing, is like I didn't trust Windows anymore, and around the time Windows 10 came out, I found I was having to look up like what these different editions do and which ones were trying to fuck me over the least. And I ended up finding that I couldn't buy the license for the version I wanted because I was trying to use LTSC, and that led me into like activation scripts and stuff. Because I had already had like 2 of my pro keys eaten by Microsoft for like hardware changes or whatever. So I'm like, I'm not fucking paying you for another key. Like, I bought 2 keys, I've earned the right, you know? I bought the license. If you revoke it, that's not my fucking problem, you know? Like, and that's what I always hated about licensed software. I don't like having a key attached to anything. I don't want it attached to an account. I don't want it hooked up to my computer. I don't want to deal with licenses. So usually I try to avoid that kind of software, like Reaper, DaVinci Resolve and all that, because I don't want to get fucked over on the license. And that's an expensive fuck up if you lose your DaVinci Resolve license, you know? So I try to support the free option, the community driven option, and that's what I do, you know? Because I don't want to be like too free software-esque, but licenses historically have fucked me over all the time, whether the software dies or the software is no longer supported and I'm stuck having to use their whatever license, and I don't like it. I don't like having that hooked up to my software. But usually the free software is like just as good for me, so it's fine. Now, that being said, I do obviously make sacrifices using Linux. You know, like I don't do the modding I used to do in games. I don't really play that many games anymore, really. I play some. But I'm not using whatever program. For the most part, I don't really think about Windows anymore. Like, it's taken 10 years or so to get to this point, but now I'm just like, I don't need Windows for anything. I don't use it. It's not something I need for my computer. So, you know, a lot of people, it's going to take a while to get out of that mindset, because I talked to this guy on the Linux Cast Discord, and he would always switch back and forth between Linux and Windows, and he would always try these Arch-based distributions that they'd never work for him correctly. So he'd switch back to Windows, but his computer is getting old and it's not going to be eligible for 11. And I said, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at, because 10's only going to be supported for so much longer. I don't think vendors are going to drop it anytime soon, but like, I try to be on the latest version of the operating system I'm using, because I don't care enough about security, but I care enough to be like, okay, I need to be updated. I need to run a supported operating system, basically. And that's something that a lot of people don't do, and it's kind of concerning that they're using these severely outdated versions of their operating system because they're just not supported. And that's something, again, I love about Linux is you're always supported. And honestly, if you're not supported, that means your computer's probably e-waste and you need to start looking for a new one. Because it's unreasonable to expect people to run. Not only does your software need to be updated, but your hardware needs to be up to date too. Like, you can't just run Ivy Bridge forever because it's no longer getting microcode updates. So if there's a security vulnerability, you're going to fall for that. But it's not like you can run Windows 11 on Ivy Bridge anyways, you know what I mean? So, dang, it's already been 30 minutes. Holy fucking shit. I told you I could just I could just talk for this for a while, And that's really what I wanted to get at, though, is if you're thinking about trying Linux, it doesn't have to be a permanent thing. You can always either run it on a separate drive, try it for a bit, switch back to Windows. You can do that back and forth all you want, but your goal at the end of the day should be, for me, it was parity, where I had all my shit that I was running on Linux on Windows, and I started restricting myself. I said, I'm not going to run this on Windows because I can't run it on Linux. And eventually I'm going to make that switch back. And once I switch back, I'm not going to have this, so I need to start learning to live without it. And you might be surprised how many things you can do. Because, when I got into this hobby, I mean, my dad always says I need a hobby, but Linux really has become kind of a passion of mine. I'm not like a developer or anything, I'm not a programmer, but I really love the way they do things. I love this community. Obviously I love my subscribers on this channel because you yahoos have been listening to me for the past 30 minutes. Good on you. But, I love this software. I love what it does for people. I love how it makes my life better. I could be endlessly entertained by Linux. It's something I wish more people knew about, because once you get into it, it's like a huge rabbit hole and there's so many things you can do. And you just don't get that experience on Windows or Mac OS or whatever. You don't get that insane level of freedom or community passion for what they're developing. And I know some people burn out because obviously people are entitled and they want the world, And that's why I don't really like people like Louis Rossmann very much, because he says, you need to make basically proprietary software in order to appease the masses. You need to have a lot of money funneled into it. This is not true. It's not something I personally need out of my computer. I have limits on what I need to do, and I'm lucky that I'm not like a huge entertainer or whatever, where I make music or make extravagant videos or anything. I'm glad I don't need to do any of that. I'm not like a big animator or anything. I just use my computer for whatever I use my computer for. And I don't know, obviously you're not watching this video if you're really just thinking about switching to Linux. You're already in one of those two camps where you're like, I would never use Linux, or I already use it, which is probably most people. So this is just kind of a rant on why I'm using it, what I've done with Linux, and yeah, all right, thanks.